evening, and welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're traveling back roughly 700 years into the muddy lanes and smoky cottages of medieval Europe to explore one of the strangest and most misunderstood institutions of the age: marriage. Not the marriage of romance novels or Hollywood costume dramas, but the real, documented, occasionally absurd system that governed how ordinary people, farmers, millers, weavers, and laborers, found their spouses, sealed their unions, and built their households. This isn't a story about knights and princesses. It's a story about chickens used as bargaining chips, priests who lectured about sin for hours, village gossip that could make or break a family's reputation, and a legal and religious machinery so thorough that it reached into nearly every corner of a person's private life. If you're here to relax, to drift off slowly into sleep, let this be your companion. A long, gentle, factual journey through a world both foreign and strangely familiar. Settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin. Marriage as contract, not romance. To understand medieval marriage, the first thing we have to set aside is the modern idea that marriage exists primarily as an expression of love. In the villages of medieval England, France, and much of Western Europe between roughly 1100 and 1500, marriage functioned first and foremost as an economic and social contract. Historians describe it as a mechanism for transferring property, securing labor, and forming alliances between families. The emotional bond between spouses, if it existed at all, was expected to grow afterward, not precede the wedding. This is a crucial distinction. In the modern imagination, we tend to assume that people throughout history fell in love and then married. But in most peasant communities of the period, marriages were arranged by parents, often years in advance, based on practical considerations. Did the families own adjoining land? Did one family need labor that the other could provide? Was there a debt or obligation to settle? Could a marriage prevent a dispute over a shared well, a boundary hedge, or grazing rights? Records from manorial courts, the local courts that handled disputes on a lord's estate, show marriages being negotiated with the same seriousness as land transactions, because in many ways, they were land transactions. A daughter's marriage might come with a strip of arable land, a share of livestock, or tools. A son's marriage might bring labor into the household or forge, a peace between feuding neighbors. None of this means love was entirely absent. Church records occasionally show couples who married for affection, sometimes even against their parents' wishes, and canon law technically required the consent of both parties. But consent under pressure, economic, social, and religious pressure, was a very different thing from consent as we understand it today. Refusing an arranged match could mean being disowned, losing access to family land, or being blamed for a ruined alliance between two households. The village as witness, privacy as a concept, barely existed in a medieval village. Most peasant families lived in single or two-room cottages, often shared with parents, siblings, and sometimes livestock, brought in during cold months for warmth. A village might hold anywhere from 50 to a few hundred people, most of whom knew each other's business intimately, who owed grain to whom, whose cow had stopped producing milk, and whose daughter was of marriageable age. This meant that courtship and marriage negotiations were never truly private affairs. Betrothals were discussed at the village well, where women gathered daily to draw water and exchange news. They were debated at the alehouse, where men settled the practical terms over cups of weak ale. Historians studying manorial and church court records have found that neighbors frequently testified in disputes over broken marriage promises, suggesting that the entire community tracked who was promised to whom and held people accountable to those promises. This communal oversight served a purpose. In a world without centralized record-keeping for most peasants, the community itself functioned as the record. If a man denied he had promised to marry a woman, witnesses from the village could attest to conversations they'd overheard, agreements they'd seen sealed with a handshake or a shared cup of ale. The wellside gossip wasn't just idle chatter. It was, in a very real sense, the village's living archive. Betrothal and the weight of childhood promises. Betrothals, the formal agreement to marry, could be arranged remarkably early in a person's life, while actual marriage ceremonies for peasants typically took place when both parties were in their mid to late teens or older. The negotiations and agreements behind those marriages sometimes began when the children involved were very young, occasionally even in infancy, particularly among families with land or property to protect. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the Catholic Church had increasingly asserted control over the definition of a valid marriage. Canon law eventually required that both parties freely consent to the union at the time of the wedding itself, a legal safeguard against forced marriage. In practice, however, the social and economic pressures on a young person to honor a betrothal arranged by their parents were immense. Refusing a match your family had spent years negotiating wasn't simply a personal choice. It could unravel land agreements, debts, and alliances that affected the whole household. One custom associated with betrothals in some regions was a form of hand-fasting, a ritual in which the couple, or sometimes their families, would clasp hands, occasionally through a hold stone or over a threshold, to symbolically seal the agreement. Historians continue to debate how widespread this specific practice was, and whether it carried legal weight or was simply a symbolic gesture layered on top of the actual legal agreement. What is well documented is that betrothals were taken seriously enough that breaking one without cause could result in a dispute brought before a church court, with financial penalties attached. The dowry practical, not romantic. Perhaps no aspect of medieval marriage illustrates its transactional nature better than the dowry. In medieval Europe, the dowry was the property, goods, or money a bride's family provided to the new household upon marriage. For peasant families, this was rarely glamorous. It typically consisted of practical items: linens, cooking pots, a bit of livestock, such as chickens or a goat, tools, or occasionally a small parcel of land, if the family had any to spare. By the 13th century, the dowry had become a cornerstone of marriage negotiations across social classes, though the scale differed enormously. Noble families negotiated dowries worth substantial sums of money, land, or titles. Peasant families negotiated over chickens, cloth, and stools. But the underlying principle was the same. The dowry represented the bride's family's contribution to the new household's economic viability, and its size and content were haggled over extensively before a wedding could proceed. Historians remain divided on what the dowry meant for women's status. Some argue that a dowry gave a bride a form of leverage. Technically, in many jurisdictions, dowry property remained legally hers, or reverted to her or her family if the marriage ended through widowhood, or in rare cases annulment. This meant a woman wasn't entirely without economic standing in her marriage. Others argue that regardless of legal technicalities, the practical effect of the dowry system was to treat women as part of an economic transaction between families, with negotiations over goods happening around them rather than with their input. Disputes over dowries could become genuinely contentious. Manorial and church court records from the period include cases where families argued bitterly over whether promised items had actually been delivered, whether livestock included in a dowry had since died or been substituted, and whether land promised as part of a marriage settlement had the boundaries both sides believed it did. These negotiations could stretch on for weeks, sometimes threatening to derail a wedding entirely if the two families couldn't agree on terms. The morning of the wedding, practical preparations. When the wedding day finally arrived, there was little time for sentimentality. Peasant households operated on a schedule dictated by chores, and a wedding day, however significant, didn't erase the need to milk cows, tend fires, or prepare food for dozens of guests. Historical records and later ethnographic studies of preserved rural customs suggest that brides in peasant communities typically rose at dawn, as on any other day, and spent the morning hours helping with final preparations rather than resting or being pampered. Bathing before a wedding, where it happened at all, was a modest affair. Most peasant households did not have private bathing facilities. A tub or large basin might be filled with water heated over the hearth, often set up behind a screen of woven branches or cloth for a measure of privacy from the rest of the household. Soap, where used, was typically a harsh, homemade preparation made from rendered fat and ash, a far cry from any modern toiletry. The goal of this washing wasn't luxury. It was to appear clean and presentable, which by the standards of the day signaled a family's respectability and served as a small courtesy to guests and the church. Clothing for a peasant bride was rarely bought new. rural families simply couldn't afford it. Instead, brides typically wore their best existing garment, sometimes borrowed or handed down from an older relative or a cousin who had married previously. Dye colors available to peasants were limited by cost: woad for blue, madder for red, weld for yellow. And even these modest dyed garments represented a genuine investment for a family with little disposable income. A dress passed down through a family for multiple weddings was common and unremarkable. One widely documented custom across various regions of medieval Europe involved decorating the bride with flowers or greenery, often woven into a simple crown or garland. The symbolism varied by region. Some traditions tied floral crowns to fertility, others to warding off misfortune, and still others treated it simply as festive decoration befitting a celebration. Historians studying folk customs note that many of these floral traditions likely blended pre-Christian practices with later Christian symbolism, a pattern common throughout medieval folk religion, where older agricultural and seasonal customs persisted alongside, rather than being replaced by church teachings. Footwear was another practical concern. Walking barefoot to a wedding, in many regional folk traditions, was considered an ill omen, one of many superstitions attached to the wedding day. Families who could scrape together a pair of shoes, even used or ill-fitting ones, would ensure the bride wore them for the walk to the church. This reflects a broader pattern in medieval peasant superstition. An enormous body of folk belief existed around avoiding bad luck through small, specific actions: not stepping on cracks, not tripping on thresholds, not spilling certain substances, much of which existed in an uneasy but persistent coexistence with official church doctrine that officially discouraged superstition, while, in practice, tolerating or even quietly absorbing many of these customs into local religious life. The village gathers social dynamics of wedding day. By the time preparations were complete, the wedding itself had become, in effect, a community event rather than a private family occasion. Village populations in medieval England, for instance, often ranged from under 100 to a few hundred residents in a typical rural parish, meaning that a wedding involving any established family was, by necessity, witnessed and discussed by nearly the entire community. This communal visibility served several practical functions beyond mere spectacle. First, it provided public confirmation that the marriage had taken place according to proper custom and law, important in a society where written records were sparse and community memory served as a primary form of verification. Second, weddings functioned as a form of social bonding and entertainment in communities where such occasions were relatively rare amid the routine grind of agricultural labor. A wedding feast, however modest, offered a break from daily toil, a chance to eat food that wasn't part of the usual subsistence diet, and an opportunity for socializing that the demands of farm labor rarely permitted. Historical and anthropological anthropological studies of peasant communities note that this intense communal scrutiny cut both ways. On one hand, it provided a support network, neighbors, who would share resources, labor, and food during a wedding celebration, and who would continue to provide mutual aid throughout married life, as peasant survival depended heavily on cooperative relationships between households. On the other hand, it meant an almost total absence of privacy, with a new bride's household management, her husband's behavior, and eventually her family's fertility, all becoming subjects of open village discussion and judgment. Gossip, in this context, functioned as a form of informal social regulation. Village women, in particular, are documented through court records and later folklore collection as having maintained detailed informal knowledge of relationships, reputations, and obligations within the community, who had a reputation for a bad temper, whose family had a history of unpaid debts, which households were considered reliable trading partners, a prospective bride's family reputation, and by extension her own, were subjects of this ongoing informal accounting well before her wedding day arrived, and would continue to be assessed long after. The church ceremony and canon law. By the High Middle Ages, the Catholic Church had positioned itself as the central authority over the legitimacy of marriage. This was a gradual development. In earlier centuries, marriage in much of Europe had been a largely private or family-negotiated matter, with the Church playing a smaller role. Over the course of the 12th and 13th centuries, however, the Church progressively asserted that marriage was a sacrament, one of the 7 sacraments recognized by Catholic doctrine, placing it under ecclesiastical jurisdiction and requiring specific conditions to be met for a marriage to be considered valid and binding. These conditions, as codified by canon law, generally required that both parties freely consent to the marriage, that neither party was already married or bound by a prior valid betrothal, that the couple was not too closely related by blood or existing family ties, a category called consanguinity, which the Church defined broadly, and which occasionally created complications in small villages where most families were distantly related, and that the marriage be solemnized appropriately, ideally, though not always strictly, with a priest present. The ceremony itself, for peasant couples, was typically a relatively brief affair compared to modern weddings, often conducted at the church door, or just inside the entrance rather than at the altar itself. A practice with roots in older traditions where the exchange of vows was considered a legal and social act witnessed publicly, with the subsequent nuptial mass, where one was held, taking place afterward inside the church. The priest's role included verifying that there was no legal or religious impediment to the marriage, receiving the couple's vows, and offering blessings and religious instruction regarding the couple's expected conduct as husband and wife. Sermons delivered at weddings, based on surviving texts and instructional manuals, used by clergy of the period commonly emphasized themes of marital duty, the religious significance of the union, and the expected roles of husband and wife within a Christian household. Themes drawing heavily on biblical texts, particularly Pauline epistles regarding marriage and household order, and on the Genesis narrative of Adam and Eve, which was frequently invoked to explain and justify the hierarchical structure the Church taught should exist between husband and wife. It's worth noting that historians studying these sermons and instructional texts point out that the tone and content varied considerably depending on the individual priest, the specific region, and the period in question. Not all clergy delivered harsh or heavily moralizing sermons. Some surviving texts emphasize mutual affection and partnership between spouses, reflecting a strand of medieval religious thought that did value companionship within marriage, even while still operating within a broader framework of hierarchical gender roles typical of the period. Rings, vows, and symbolic objects. The exchange of a ring during the wedding ceremony has ancient roots predating medieval Christianity, but by the medieval period, it had become a well-established part of Christian marriage ritual in much of Europe. For peasant couples, wedding rings were typically simple bands, often iron or another inexpensive metal, in contrast to the gold or gem-set rings that wealthier families could afford. The ring served as a visible, durable symbol of the marriage contract, one that could be worn daily as an ongoing public marker of marital status. The vows themselves, based on surviving liturgical texts from the period, generally involved the couple pledging fidelity, and in many versions specifically committing to remain together through both good fortune and hardship, in health and in sickness, until death. These vows were typically spoken in the vernacular language of the region rather than in Latin, specifically so that the couple and the assembled community could understand and bear witness to the commitment being made. An important legal as well as religious consideration, since the vows themselves constituted the legally binding act of marriage. Some regional traditions incorporated additional symbolic objects into the ceremony beyond the ring. A coin, sometimes referred to in various traditions as ars or wedding tokens, might be given by the groom to the bride as a symbol of his commitment to provide for the household financially. The specific customs varied significantly by region, and historians caution against assuming uniformity across medieval Europe, which was not a single unified culture, but a patchwork of distinct regional customs, languages, and legal traditions, loosely bound together by the shared institutional framework of the Catholic Church. The wedding feast. Following the church ceremony, the wedding feast represented the centerpiece of communal celebration. For peasant families, hosting a feast was a significant financial undertaking, and it was common practice for the burden to be shared communally. Neighbors and relatives frequently contributed food, drink, or labor toward the celebration, a practice consistent with the broader cooperative economic structures that characterized peasant village life. The food served at a peasant wedding feast reflected what was locally available and seasonally appropriate, rather than any standardized wedding menu. Common fare included bread, of course the dietary staple across virtually all medieval European communities, along with pottage or stew made from whatever vegetables and grains were on hand. And meat, when the family could afford it, pork, particularly from a pig raised and slaughtered specifically for the occasion, was a relatively common choice among peasant families who kept pigs, since pork could be preserved, and a pig slaughter provided a substantial amount of meat for a large gathering. Ale was the standard beverage at such gatherings, as it was safer to drink than the often contaminated water available in many villages, and it was typically brewed at a lower alcohol content than modern beer, meaning that while people certainly did become intoxicated at these celebrations, the ale itself was somewhat more dilute than modern equivalents. Wine, where available, was generally more expensive and associated with wealthier households, though it might appear at peasant celebrations in smaller quantities, sometimes spiced with available herbs, and considered something of a treat. Music and entertainment at these feasts typically came from within the community itself, rather than professional entertainers, though traveling musicians and entertainers did exist and might be hired for significant celebrations if a family could afford it. Fiddles, pipes, and simple drums are documented as common instruments among peasant communities, and dancing, singing, and various games and competitions, wrestling matches, archery contests, and similar tests of skill are well documented as common features of medieval village celebrations generally. Wedding feasts very much included. These feasts often stretched across many hours, sometimes an entire day, reflecting both the significance of the occasion and the practical reality that gathering an entire village together was itself a relatively rare event worth extending as long as resources allowed. Historical records suggest that such feasts could indeed become quite rowdy as the hours wore on and ale consumption increased, with manorial court records occasionally documenting disputes, fights, or property damage arising from wedding celebrations that got somewhat out of hand. Superstition, luck, and the fear of bad omens. Medieval peasant life was steeped in superstition, existing in an uneasy but persistent relationship with official church doctrine. While the church officially condemned what it classified as pagan superstition and sorcery, in practice, a vast body of folk belief continued to operate throughout medieval Europe, often blending seamlessly with sanctioned religious practice in ways that made the boundary between the two difficult to distinguish, even for contemporaries. Wedding day superstitions were particularly numerous. likely because marriage represented such a significant life transition, with so much riding on its success. Economically, socially, and in terms of producing the heirs necessary to continue the family line and maintain claims to land and property. Documented superstitions from various regions include beliefs that a bride tripping on her way to the church signaled future misfortune in the marriage, that certain days of the week were luckier than others for holding a wedding, that specific weather conditions on the wedding day carried omens about the marriage's future, and that particular foods, herbs, or objects present during the wedding could influence fertility or marital harmony. Historians studying these folk beliefs generally caution against treating them as uniform or universally held. The evidence suggests considerable regional variation, with beliefs common in one area of, say, England being entirely unknown or different in another region just a few dozen miles away, let alone across the broader geography of medieval Europe. Additionally, the strength of belief in any particular superstition likely varied considerably among individuals, much as it does in any society. Some people took these customs very seriously, while others may have observed them more as tradition or social expectation than genuine conviction. The Church's view on marital duty. The medieval Catholic Church developed an extensive body of theological writing on the nature and purpose of marriage. Marriage was understood to serve several purposes: the procreation of children, the provision of a legitimate outlet for sexual desire within the bounds of a sanctioned relationship, and mutual support and companionship between spouses. Theologians of the period, drawing on earlier writers such as Augustine, wrote extensively about what came to be termed the marriage debt. The concept that spouses owed each other a mutual obligation within marriage, discussed in theological texts primarily as an issue of mutual obligation, rather than something unilaterally owed by one spouse to the other. It's worth emphasizing, based on what historians of medieval religious thought have documented, that these were complex theological discussions carried out primarily among clergy and scholars, and the extent to which such nuanced doctrine was communicated to or fully understood by ordinary peasant parishioners is difficult to establish with certainty. Village priests varied enormously in their education and theological sophistication, and the actual content of what an ordinary peasant couple heard preached at their wedding likely varied considerably depending on their specific priest, region, and era. Establishing the new household. Following the wedding celebrations, a peasant couple faced the practical task of establishing their household, a process that, depending on regional custom and family circumstances, might involve moving into a portion of one set of parents' existing home, constructing or acquiring a separate dwelling, or in some cases, the husband moving into property associated with the wife's family, though patrilocal customs, where the wife moved to live near, or with the husband's family were more common across most of medieval Europe. The new household's economic viability depended heavily on the combined resources brought into the marriage. The dowry from the bride's family, any property or tools brought by the groom, and the ongoing support networks of both extended families. Peasant households functioned as economic units in which both husband and wife contributed essential labor. Though the division of labor typically followed gendered patterns common throughout medieval Europe, men more commonly engaged in fieldwork, heavier agricultural labor, and trades, while women more commonly managed food preparation, textile production, such as spinning and weaving, small livestock, and child-rearing. Though these divisions were far from absolute, and women are well documented participating in fieldwork, particularly during harvest, while men participated in various domestic tasks as needed. The first weeks learning to run a household, the days immediately following a wedding, brought little pause for reflection. Medieval agricultural life ran on a relentless seasonal calendar, and a new wife's transition into her married household happened alongside, not instead of, the ongoing demands of daily labor. Historians of peasant life describe this period as one of rapid, often difficult adjustment, particularly for young brides who may have had years of preparation in domestic skills, but little practical experience running an independent household rather than assisting in their mothers. A peasant wife's responsibilities were extensive and varied by season. Daily tasks typically included tending the hearth fire, which needed to be carefully maintained, since starting a fire from scratch using flint and steel was time-consuming. And many households tried to keep embers alive overnight rather than restart the process each morning. Bread making was a near universal task, though the specifics varied. Some households baked their own bread in a home oven or over the hearth, while others, particularly in villages where a lord held baking rights, brought dough to a communal oven for a fee, a system that itself sometimes became a source of local grievance when tenants felt the fees were excessive. Beyond food preparation, a wife's responsibilities commonly extended to dairying if the household kept a cow or goats, tending a kitchen garden for vegetables and herbs, caring for chickens and other small livestock, spinning wool or flax into thread, and depending on the region and household's economic activities, weaving cloth either for the family's own use or for sale or trade. Textile production in particular represented a significant economic contribution. Spun thread and woven cloth could be sold or traded, providing supplementary household income beyond agricultural produce. Historians studying manorial records and household accounts note that peasant wives frequently played a significant, if often underdocumented, role in the household's broader economic decision-making, including participating in trade at local markets, managing household food stores, and in some documented cases, taking on significant responsibility for a household's affairs during a husband's absence, illness, or death. The formal legal framework of the period, which generally placed the husband as head of household with significant legal authority over shared property, existed alongside a practical reality in which many wives exercised considerable informal influence and responsibility. The legal status of married women under the legal systems of medieval Europe, which varied by region, but shared broad similarities rooted in a combination of customary law, canon law, and in some areas emerging codified civil law. A married woman's legal status, known in English common law by the later term coverture, generally subordinated her legal identity to her husband's in significant ways. Property a woman brought into marriage often came under her husband's control and management during the marriage, though the specifics varied considerably by region and by the type of property involved, with dowry property sometimes retaining special legal protections intended to benefit the wife or revert to her in case of widowhood. This legal subordination should be understood within its historical context, rather than through an entirely modern lens, historians caution, without suggesting that the arrangement was equitable by modern standards. Women could not typically enter into contracts independently, sue or be sued in court without their husband's involvement, or exercise many forms of legal agency available to unmarried women or widows, who in many jurisdictions actually held more independent legal standing than married women, since a widow regained control over her own property and legal identity upon her husband's death. Despite these legal constraints, historical evidence, including court records, wills, and household accounts, demonstrates that women exercised meaningful influence within their households and communities through informal channels, managing daily household economics, participating actively in village social and economic networks, and in numerous documented cases, effectively directing significant household decisions, even where formal legal authority rested with the husband. Historians studying gender in medieval society generally caution against viewing medieval women as uniformly powerless, while also cautioning against overcorrecting into a rosier picture than the legal and social realities actually supported. Domestic violence and the Church's position, it's necessary, in an honest historical account, to address the reality of domestic violence within medieval marriage, a topic historians have researched extensively through court records, penitential texts, and legal codes. Medieval society, broadly speaking, granted husbands a degree of authority over their wives that included, in various legal and religious texts of the period, some tolerance for physical correction, generally expected to be moderate rather than severe. The Church's position on this matter was not uniform or unambiguous. Various theological and pastoral texts from the period condemned excessive violence against a wife as sinful, while others offered more permissive guidance regarding a husband's right to discipline his household, reflecting the broader patriarchal assumptions of the era. Court records, particularly from manorial and ecclesiastical courts, do show cases of women bringing complaints against abusive husbands, and some historians point to this as evidence that communities and courts did, at times, provide some measure of recourse or social sanction against husbands considered to have exceeded acceptable bounds, even if the underlying framework accepted a husband's general authority over his wife as legitimate. This is a complex and uncomfortable area of medieval social history, and historians generally caution against both overstating the protections available to medieval women and assuming uniform brutality. The reality documented in surviving records suggests wide variation depending on individual circumstances, regional custom, and the specific relationships and personalities involved. Much as domestic relationships have varied across human history, generally, pregnancy and the realities of childbirth, producing children was understood as a central purpose of marriage throughout medieval Christian Europe, tied both to religious teaching about the purpose of marriage and to the practical economic reality that children represented future agricultural labor and eventually caretakers for aging parents, as well as heirs to continue a family's claim to land and property, which in a peasant context might be a tenancy right rather than outright ownership, but which still carried significant economic value that families worked hard to preserve across generations. The medical realities of pregnancy and childbirth in this period were significant, and historians studying demographic records estimate maternal mortality rates considerably higher than in the modern developed world. Though establishing precise figures for the general population is difficult given the limitations of surviving records, common causes of maternal death included hemorrhage, infection often related to unsanitary conditions during and after delivery, and complications from difficult labor in an era without the surgical interventions, antibiotics, or blood transfusion capabilities that address these complications in modern medicine. Childbirth itself was typically managed by women. A midwife, where the community had access to one, assisted by female relatives and neighbors, with men generally excluded from the birthing space, which was understood as a distinctly female domain governed by its own body of accumulated practical knowledge, and frequently associated folk customs and religious practices intended to ease labor or protect mother and child. Midwives, though rarely formally trained in any institutionalized sense before the later medieval period in most regions, accumulated practical experience and knowledge passed down through informal networks of women, and were often respected, if sometimes also regarded with suspicion, particularly in later medieval and early modern periods. when the practice of midwifery became entangled with broader anxieties about witchcraft, though this association became more pronounced in the 15th century and after, somewhat later than the core period we're discussing tonight. The Church did engage extensively with pregnancy and childbirth through prayer, blessings, and the veneration of specific saints associated with safe delivery, reflecting genuine communal concern about the very real dangers involved rather than mere ritual formality. Various folk customs, some historians argue, likely developed alongside official religious practice as additional, informal attempts to manage anxiety about a genuinely dangerous and uncertain process. In an era when medical understanding of the physiological processes involved remained limited, raising children in a peasant household, once born, children in medieval peasant households were, from a fairly young age by modern standards, integrated into the household's economic activities. Historians of childhood in this period note that while affection between parents and children is well documented and shouldn't be assumed absent simply because childhood mortality rates were high, practical economic necessity meant that children began contributing labor considerably earlier than would be expected in most modern societies. Simple tasks like watching younger siblings, scaring birds away from planted fields, or helping with small livestock might be assigned to children as young as 5 or 6, with responsibilities increasing steadily through adolescence. Childhood mortality rates in this period were significantly higher than in the modern developed world, with historians estimating that a substantial proportion of children died before reaching adulthood, a reality that shaped family life in ways difficult to fully appreciate from a modern vantage point. Though historians caution against assuming that high mortality rates meant parents were emotionally detached from their children, considerable evidence from wills, religious texts, and other sources demonstrates deep parental grief and attachment despite, and perhaps partly because of the genuine precariousness of childhood survival, the rhythm of the agricultural year. Married life for a peasant couple was inseparable from the agricultural calendar that governed nearly every aspect of rural existence. The year divided broadly into periods of intense seasonal labor, plowing and planting in spring, tending crops through summer, the harvest in late summer and early autumn, representing perhaps the most critical and labor-intensive period of the entire year, followed by a relatively quieter winter period focused on indoor tasks like textile production, tool repair, and using stored food reserves. This seasonal rhythm shaped not only labor patterns, but also broader social and religious life. Numerous religious festivals and observances were arranged around agricultural markers, reflecting the deep integration of Christian religious practice with the agricultural cycle that governed peasant survival. Harvest time in particular carried enormous significance, since a poor harvest could mean genuine hunger or even starvation for a peasant family in the following months. And historical records from across medieval Europe document periodic famines resulting from poor harvests, extreme weather, or crop disease, events that could devastate peasant communities and dramatically affect marriage patterns, since economic hardship often delayed marriages as families waited for more secure circumstances, or in some documented cases, prompted earlier marriages as households sought to consolidate resources and labor in response to hardship. The village as a web of mutual obligation beyond the immediate household. A married couple's life was embedded within a dense network of communal relationships and obligations that historians describe as essential to peasant survival. The manorial system, which structured much of rural life across medieval England and large parts of continental Europe, bound peasant households to a lord through a combination of labor obligations, rents paid in kind or coin, and various customary rights and responsibilities that had accumulated over generations, and were often fiercely defended when a lord attempted to alter them. A newly married couple's household became, from the moment of marriage, a distinct economic unit within this system, potentially liable for its own share of labor services owed to the lord, its own portion of rent, and its own set of customary rights, such as grazing privileges on common land, or the right to gather firewood from designated areas. Establishing a new household, therefore, involved not just personal and family considerations, but a renegotiation of sorts of the couple's position within this broader manorial structure. And manorial court records from the period document the formal recognition of new tenancies and holdings that frequently accompanied marriages beyond the formal manorial structure. Informal networks of mutual aid-bound village households together in ways essential to collective survival. Cooperative labor during planting and harvest, shared use of expensive equipment like plows or mills that individual households couldn't afford independently, and informal systems of borrowing and lending food, tools, or labor during hardship, all depended on a web of ongoing relationships and reciprocal obligation that a married couple needed to maintain and participate in actively. Historians studying village social structures emphasize that this cooperative economic behavior wasn't merely neighborly kindness in the modern sense, but a practical necessity in a world where individual households faced genuine risk of catastrophic failure without communal support systems to fall back on. The church as the center of village life. The parish church functioned as far more than a place of Sunday worship in medieval village life. It served as a genuine community center around which an enormous range of social, administrative, and even economic activities revolved. Attendance at Sunday Mass was, for most of the medieval period, both a religious obligation and a significant social occasion, one of the few regular opportunities for the entire community to gather together outside of specific festivals or events like weddings. The church building itself often served practical secondary purposes beyond religious observance. Church porches and churchyards were documented locations for various forms of community business, including, in some cases, the recording of important transactions or agreements before witnesses. The parish priest, beyond his religious duties, often played a significant informal role in village life more broadly, sometimes serving as a literate intermediary for villagers who needed documents written or read, and as a figure whose opinion carried social weight in village disputes, even beyond strictly religious matters. For a married couple, ongoing engagement with parish religious life continued well beyond the wedding ceremony itself. Regular confession, participation in the numerous religious festivals that dotted the medieval calendar, and adherence to the church's teachings regarding marital conduct all represented ongoing dimensions of married life that historians of medieval religion emphasize shouldn't be understood as separate from daily practical existence, but as thoroughly interwoven with it. The church's calendar of feast days and fasting periods, for instance, directly affected household food preparation and consumption patterns throughout the year, meaning that religious observance had very concrete, practical dimensions for how a married household actually functioned day to day. Aging within marriage, for couples who survived the considerable risks of childbirth, disease, and the general hazards of medieval life to reach older age together. The later years of marriage brought their own distinct set of circumstances, as physical capacity for heavy agricultural labor diminished with age. Historical records document various arrangements peasant households made to manage this transition, sometimes involving adult children taking on increasing responsibility for household labor, while aging parents shifted toward lighter tasks or supervisory roles, and sometimes involving formal retirement agreements, documented in some regions through surviving manorial records, in which aging tenants formally transferred their landholding to an heir in exchange for a guaranteed provision of food, shelter, and care for their remaining years. These retirement agreements were documented, offer historians valuable insight into how medieval peasant families managed the practical challenges of aging in a world without pensions, retirement savings, or state-provided elder care. The specific terms varied considerably, but commonly included detailed provisions: a certain quantity of grain to be provided annually, the right to continue living in part of the family home or in a smaller adjacent dwelling, and specific care provisions in case of illness, suggesting that these were carefully negotiated arrangements rather than informal assumptions, reflecting a broader tendency in peasant legal culture toward formalizing important household and family arrangements, even among people who left few other kinds of written records behind. Widowhood and its complexities, given the demographic realities of the period, including the risks associated with childbirth for women and generally shorter overall life expectancies compared to the modern era. Widowhood was a common experience for medieval women, and historians note that a woman becoming a widow, particularly at a younger age with children still to raise, faced significant challenges, but also, somewhat counterintuitively given the constraints on married women's legal status, often gained greater legal and economic autonomy than she had possessed during marriage. Under many medieval legal systems, a widow typically regained control over her dowry property and often had specific legal rights to a portion of her deceased husband's estate, sometimes formalized through a customary provision known in various regions by terms translating roughly to a widow's portion or dower right, intended to ensure some measure of continued economic support for a widow, rather than leaving her entirely destitute upon her husband's death. The specific proportion and nature of this entitlement varied considerably by region and by the particular legal customs governing the couple's property. But the general principle of some guaranteed provision for widows was widespread across medieval Europe. Remarriage for widows was common, particularly for younger widows or those with property that made them attractive prospects for new marriage. Though historians note that widows, unlike unmarried daughters, often had considerably more personal agency in choosing whether and whom to remarry, since the pressing considerations of family alliance building that shaped a young woman's first marriage applied with less force to a widow making her own decisions about a second union. Some widows, particularly older women or those with sufficient independent means, chose not to remarry at all, managing their own households and property independently, a status that afforded them a degree of legal and social independence unavailable to them at almost any other point in their lives. Inheritance and the transfer of property. The question of inheritance sat at the heart of why marriage mattered so intensely to medieval peasant families, since a marriage represented, among other things, a critical juncture in the transfer of property and rights across generations. Inheritance customs varied considerably across medieval Europe, with different regions following different principles regarding how land and property should be divided among children. Some regions practiced what historians term primogeniture, in which the eldest son inherited the entirety or the greater portion of a family's landholding, a practice that had the effect of keeping landholdings intact across generations, rather than fragmenting them among multiple heirs, but which also meant that younger sons often needed to seek their fortune through other means, entering trades, joining the clergy, or seeking marriage into a family with land to offer. Other regions practiced partible inheritance, dividing land more or less equally among heirs, a practice that could, over successive generations, result in increasingly fragmented and economically unviable landholdings. A problem some historians point to as a contributing factor in periodic rural economic hardship in regions where this inheritance pattern predominated. Daughters' inheritance rights varied even more considerably by region and by specific family circumstance, with dowries in many cases functioning as a daughter's effective inheritance, provided at marriage rather than at a parent's death, while sons might inherit the remaining landed property. This system meant that a family's decisions about a daughter's marriage were deeply entangled with broader questions of family inheritance strategy, further reinforcing why marriage negotiations for peasant families carried such significant economic weight and warranted such careful, sometimes protracted negotiation. Regional variation across medieval Europe. It's worth pausing to emphasize as we move toward the later sections of tonight's journey, just how much regional variation existed across what we've been broadly describing as medieval Europe. The customs, legal frameworks, and social practices we've discussed tonight drew primarily on patterns documented across medieval England and parts of France, regions for which historians have relatively rich surviving records. But practices in Iberia, Scandinavia, the Holy Roman Empire, Italy, and Eastern Europe often differed in significant ways, reflecting different legal traditions, different balances of power between local nobility and central authority, different agricultural systems suited to different climates and terrains, and different historical relationships with the Catholic Church, particularly in regions with significant Orthodox, Christian, Jewish, or Muslim populations living alongside or under Christian rule. Historians studying medieval marriage customs generally caution strongly against treating any single regional pattern as universally representative of medieval Europe as a whole. A caution worth bearing in mind throughout everything we've discussed tonight. What we've presented represents documented patterns from particular regions and particular types of surviving records, primarily English and French manorial, ecclesiastical, and legal records, rather than a single, uniform medieval European experience. How historians know what they know. It's worth taking a moment to reflect on how historians actually reconstruct this picture of peasant marriage and family life. Given that the peasants themselves, being largely illiterate, left few, if any, direct written records of their own experiences, the primary sources historians rely on include manorial court records, which document disputes, transactions, and formal recognitions of tenancy and inheritance. Ecclesiastical court records, which handled marriage disputes, accusations of adultery, and other matters falling under church jurisdiction. Wills, where they survive, which document property and its intended distribution. tax records and manorial surveys, which document population, landholding, and economic activity, and a smaller body of instructional and moralizing texts written by clergy and other literate figures, intended to guide proper Christian behavior, which offer insight into official expectations, even when they may not accurately reflect actual peasant behavior and belief. Archaeological evidence, including excavated peasant dwellings, provides additional physical evidence about living conditions, household size, and material culture that complements the documentary record. More recently, historians have increasingly turned to demographic analysis, using surviving records to reconstruct patterns of marriage age, family size, mortality, and other quantifiable aspects of medieval peasant life with greater precision than earlier, more impressionistic historical accounts allowed. This composite picture, built from fragmentary and imperfect sources, inevitably contains gaps, uncertainties, and ongoing scholarly debate, which is why throughout tonight's journey, we've tried to note where historians disagree, or where evidence remains limited, rather than presenting a falsely uniform or definitively certain picture of a world that, in reality, remains only partially visible to us across the centuries. Love within medieval marriage, what the evidence actually shows. Having spent so much time on the practical, economic, and legal dimensions of medieval marriage, it's worth returning to a question we touched on earlier. Did love have any place in this system at all? The honest historical answer is more nuanced than either the cynical view that medieval marriage was purely transactional with no room for affection, or the romanticized view that true love conquered all social constraints would suggest. Historians studying personal letters, wills, and other surviving documents that occasionally offer glimpses into individual relationships have found genuine evidence of deep affection between spouses in many documented cases. Wills, in particular, sometimes include language suggesting real tenderness. A husband leaving his wife not merely her legally entitled portion, but additional bequests described in terms suggesting genuine care for her well-being, or provisions specifically designed to ensure a widow's comfort beyond what custom strictly required. Such evidence, while not universal, suggests that many medieval marriages, even those that began as practical arrangements between families, developed into relationships involving real mutual affection and partnership over years and decades of shared life, labor, and child-rearing. At the same time, historians are careful not to overstate this evidence into a picture where love was simply assumed or guaranteed. The system, as a whole, prioritized economic and social considerations in forming marriages, and whatever affection developed did so within, rather than instead of, this practical framework. Medieval literature itself reflects this tension. Courtly love poetry and troubadour traditions which did circulate and influence popular culture even in rural areas to some degree, often explicitly celebrated romantic love as something separate from, sometimes even in tension with, the practical institution of marriage, suggesting that medieval people themselves recognized a gap between the ideal of romantic love and the practical realities of how most marriages were actually formed. Folk belief, fertility, and the blending of old and new. Throughout this account, we've touched repeatedly on the persistent presence of folk belief and superstition existing alongside official Christian doctrine. This blending deserves a closer, more reflective look, since it tells us something important about how ordinary medieval people actually experienced their religious and cultural world, as opposed to how official church teaching prescribed they should experience it. Historians of medieval popular religion describe a complex, layered reality in which pre-Christian folk practices, many with roots extending back centuries, or even longer before Christianity's arrival in a given region, persisted and adapted rather than disappearing entirely under Christian influence. Practices associated with fertility, agricultural success, and protection from misfortune often took on a syncretic character, blending older folk elements with Christian symbols, saints, and prayers in ways that made the two difficult to fully separate, even for the people practicing them. The Church's response to this persistent folk practice varied considerably across time and place. Some clergy actively campaigned against practices they identified as superstitious or pagan in origin, while others appear to have tolerated or even quietly incorporated popular customs into local religious practice, perhaps recognizing the practical impossibility of eliminating deeply rooted cultural patterns, or perhaps genuinely not perceiving a sharp distinction between officially sanctioned religious practice and popular custom in the way that a modern observer, looking back with a clearer sense of doctrinal boundaries, might expect. Resilience and the texture of daily survival. If there's a single theme that emerges most consistently from the historical record of medieval peasant marriage and family life, it's resilience in the face of genuine hardship. The margins of survival for medieval peasant households were often thin. A poor harvest, an illness, the loss of a working animal, or a bad decision in a property negotiation could mean genuine hardship or even threat a family's continued economic viability. Within this context, marriage functioned as a fundamental survival strategy, pooling labor, resources, and social connections in ways essential to weathering the genuine uncertainties of medieval agricultural life. The women and men who navigated this system, arranging marriages for practical advantage, negotiating dowries down to the last chicken, and building households and families within a legal and social framework that offered them limited individual autonomy, were not passive victims of their circumstances. Historians increasingly emphasize but active participants who exercised whatever agency the system allowed them, finding ways to shape their own lives and protect their family's interests within genuinely constraining structures. This doesn't erase the real limitations and hardships of the system, but it does complicate any simple narrative of medieval people as either helpless victims of an oppressive system or straightforward believers in a system that we might otherwise judge harshly by modern standards. What changed and what persisted? It's worth briefly noting as we bring this long journey toward its close that the patterns described throughout this account weren't static across the entire medieval period, which itself spanned roughly 1,000 years and encompassed enormous social, economic, and religious change. Marriage customs in the 11th century differed in meaningful ways from those of the 14th or 15th century, shaped by developments including the Church's gradually increasing assertion of authority over marriage as a sacrament, demographic upheavals such as the Black Death in the mid-14th century, which dramatically altered labor markets, and some historians argue temporarily improved the negotiating position of surviving peasants relative to landowners, and gradual shifts in agricultural technique, urbanization, and trade that slowly reshaped the broader economic context within which peasant marriage operated. Many of the fundamental patterns we've discussed tonight, however, showed remarkable persistence across these centuries and in various modified forms well beyond the medieval period itself. Arranged marriage, considering practical family interests, dowry systems, communal oversight of marriage and household life, and gendered divisions of labor within marriage all persisted in evolving forms into the early modern period, and in some regions considerably beyond, a testament to how deeply these patterns were embedded in the broader economic and social structures of pre-industrial agricultural societies generally, not merely a specific feature of the medieval period in isolation. As we bring tonight's long journey to close, it's worth sitting for a moment with the central paradox at the heart of everything we've discussed. A system that, by modern standards, offered individuals, and particularly women, remarkably limited personal autonomy in one of life's most significant decisions, and yet one within which countless individuals built lives of genuine meaning, resilience, mutual support, and in many documented cases, real affection and partnership. The historical record doesn't allow us to romanticize medieval marriage as some lost golden age of stability and community, nor does it allow us to dismiss it simply as an oppressive system devoid of human warmth. The truth, as is so often the case in history, sits in the more complicated middle ground, a practical, economically grounded institution shaped by religious doctrine, communal oversight, and genuine hardship, within which real human beings navigated their circumstances with whatever resilience, humor, and quiet resistance they could bring to bear. Historians continue to study this period, uncovering new records, reassessing old assumptions, and gradually building an ever more detailed and nuanced picture of how ordinary people, whose names rarely appear in the grand historical narratives of kings and wars, actually lived their daily lives, formed their households, raised their children, and in their own ways endured. Let the pace of the evening settle now. The plowed fields, the smoky hearths, the well-side gossip, the dowry negotiations over a stubborn meadow. Let all of it recede slowly, like mist lifting off a quiet valley at first light. There's nothing left to track tonight. No more names, no more dates, no more disputes to follow. Picture instead a single peasant cottage at the very end of a long day. The fire is banked low. The animals are settled. The fields outside lie dark and still under a wide, star-scattered sky, waiting patiently for tomorrow's labor. Whatever hardships the day carried, they're set down now, if only for a few hours. Let your own thoughts settle the same way. Whatever you carried into this evening, the day's small worries, its unfinished tasks, set them down too. The way a farmer sets down a plow at dusk, trusting the field will still be there in the morning. Breathe slowly. Let the weight of the day continue to lift. There's nowhere else to be right now, and nothing left to do but rest. Sleep well,